We're talking today with Mr. James VandenBosch of Ada, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, Mr. VandenBosch, can you begin by giving us just some background on yourself? Where and when were you born, for instance?
Well, I was born and raised not more than 2 or 3 miles from here. I grew up in this area and attended Crescent High School. I think my military background started there. I was in ROTC for 2 years at Crescent High School.
Okay, and what years roughly were those?
That was 58, 59.
Okay.
And then my family moved to Rockford, so graduated from Rockford High School. Then matriculated at Grand Rapids Junior College, as it was known then. Graduated from there after 2 years. Went on to Michigan State for a brief stint that didn't work out very well. Then came back and wound up at Western Michigan. And again, at that point in time, I was in my early 20s, and I was getting a little tired of the academic world and wasn't really doing much at all except having a lot of fun in college, and that was just wasting my parents' money. So for some reason that prompted me to join the Navy, and I joined the Navy with an associate's degree, so I got a little bit of an advance up the ladder as far as where you start in enlisted ranks.
All right. Now, what year was that you enlisted?
1966.
Okay. And at the time you enlisted, what, if anything, did you know about what was going on in the world, and certainly in places like Vietnam or with the Cold War or whatever?
I think I probably had a pretty generally good idea of what was going on in the world. For some reason, I can remember when I was about 10 or 12 years old in the mid-50s, the Korean conflict was going on. And of course, by that time, they were having excerpts of it on television. And I remember being afraid and concerned about things that were going on, even at that early age. I've sort of thought my worldview has been a little bit broader than most people, and I don't have an explanation for that. For some reason, I just had kind of a global point of view of things, and was concerned about it back then. Obviously, through high school and then into college, in the 60s was just a decade of turmoil. Anyway, and well aware of that, but still, something inside me was the old values, the things that I believed in. Never been into politics. Knew there was a lot of counterproductive things going on in the country at that time, especially in the college campuses with a lot of dissent and so forth.
Of course, in '66, I guess the civil rights movement had been pretty powerful for a while. The peak of the anti-war movement is going to be a little bit later at that point.
Yeah.
So but still, I mean, you have beginnings of the counterculture going and a lot of other things like that.
Well, it was prevalent, but I would say, again, not in my immediate world, because I wasn't living in Rockford at the time, which back then was still pretty much a farming community. Very, I don't know, not really up to speed at that time. Very conservative nature, which is, again, my basic philosophy is very conservative. So in some ways we were very sheltered from what was going on, except for the fact that I had been on several college campuses in the last 3 or 4 years and had picked up on some of that. And of course the news and all the demonstrations that were going on, we were not immune to that. But somehow I still felt that in a rebound from academia, I had to do something worthwhile. And in my roots, my values said, and by the way, I was and still am a patriot. I use that word with great emphasis. I had to do something worthwhile. And when I was going to school, I had been working at Butterworth Hospital as an orderly, so I got kind of a basic starting in my medicine and health career. And so when I joined the Navy, I joined as a hospital corpsman and wouldn't have gone in any other way because I enlisted. I was not drafted. So I had a choice. And again, that 2-year degree gave me a bit of a benefit. I started out as an E3 rather than E1. An HN at that time actually was designated before I went to boot camp, not as a seaman, but as an HN. which is just a little slight distinction, but it is important anyway.
Now, what does HN actually stand for?
Hospitalman.
Okay.
They used to be pharmacist mate, and before that they were loblolly boys. That's the
Right.
history of the hospital corps going
Right.
all the way back to sailing ships. So then, in that year, then I went through boot camp, and then basically went across the street to hospital corps school, which was about another 13-week stint there.
Tell us a little bit about each of those. What was the boot camp like at Great Lakes at that point?
Boot camp, Great Lakes, we were there, I'm trying to remember, it wasn't winter, I know that for sure, so probably during the summer. I know I probably left in August or something like that. Boot camp, Navy boot camp is not very much like the other services boot camps, in that the Army and the Marine Corps train much differently than the Navy does, for obvious reasons. Most of us were destined to go aboard ship, and therefore got very little training in hand-to-hand combat or that sort of thing. We learned how to tie knots, learned how to fix holes in the side of a ship, learned how to march, and did all that stuff that all the services do.
Was there an emphasis on learning discipline and following orders?
Well, yeah, that's what boot camp is designed to do. The whole idea of all the services, actually, one of the main factors in going through a boot camp or any other institution is they shave your head. And they shave your head for a very good purpose, and the reason is that a lot of people's personality seems to be tied up in their hair. And when you all come out of the barbershop completely bald, it makes you all just look alike, and therefore they start the process of breaking you down into what they want you to be. And of course, the people that run boot camp companies are old salts, in my case from the Navy. Chief Bosun's mate that had been around forever, and he was a very large, tall man, very brusque, very rough, a very profane gentleman, but he was so dominating that we all just sort of would not have dared to look at him crosswise, and he got his message across very well, to the point where we just all fell right in line and did exactly what we were supposed to do, and that's the whole idea of boot camp anyway.
Right. How well did you adjust to that kind of discipline?
Well, actually, I was surprised. I'd had a little bit of military thing with the ROTC, so I knew all the basic moves, you know, how to salute and how to march and how to do the rifle drill and all that kind of stuff, and actually kind of liked it. When I was a kid growing up here, I spent most of my time outdoors in the woods and tromping around. At the age of, ripe old age of 10 or 12, I had my own .22 rifle, and I was out doing things outside all the time. So the military was a way of getting my life in order, and which it hadn't been up to that point. All those years through school, I had just no idea who or what I was going to be or what I wanted to do or anything else, and totally aimless. So it brought me into focus to find out who I was and what I was capable of, because even the Navy boot camp, as comparatively innocuous as it is to the Marine Corps boot camp, for example, is a trying, stress-producing situation, and they do their best to scare the living crap out of you, while guiding you and training you how to be a member of a team. The whole idea in becoming like everybody else is that you have to, in order to accomplish your mission, you have to work together. You cannot be an individual. If you are, it simply doesn't work. And I know, thinking all the way back to those days, throughout the rest of my career, those fundamentals were what helped me do what I needed to do later on as events unfolded.
Now, did it help you or get in your way that you were maybe a little bit older than a lot of the guys you were in there with?
I think that it helped in all of the situations that I found myself in the military from that day forward, because actually, even in boot camp, I was put into a leadership position. I was the first platoon commander. There were all recruits, of course. There were 3 platoons, and each platoon had to have a commander, and then we had the company commander, which is just like a standard military company is, and that's the way they did it, and that's why they did it that way. But I was a little older. I was in my early 20s, so I think I probably had certainly a little bit more world experience than a lot of the younger recruits that were coming in. And my mindset was a little different. I was frightened. I was under a great deal of stress, but I took some strength from that, and found, I think, pretty much that the training was designed to do that. They take people completely out of this very civilian world with no concept of what it is, and turn you into a product. Your product is, in this case, a sailor with a whole lot of other sailors, like a ship on shore, and you all start to think and act and behave the same way, and that's a process that has to go on.
Okay. Now, what was the next level of training like? What did you do there?
After graduation from boot camp, we went right across the street, actually. Well, this is at Great Lakes, by the way, in the Hospital Corps School. The Hospital Corps School is designed to take people out of boot camp and transform them into hospital corpsmen. Hospital corpsman training in the Navy is different from what I know about Army medic training, because the Navy is such a diverse organization. Hospital corpsmen need to be able to function in hospitals, doing regular nursing care, on ships, doing all kinds of exciting things, which actually I did later on. And then we also have to provide combat medic service for the Marine Corps, because the Marine Corps does not have its own indigenous medical corps. Hospital corpsmen from the Navy are inserted into units of Marine Corps in a combat role. So I think, and maybe there's a certain bias here, but I think we were trained a little bit more in depth and much more flexible to be able to do many different tasks. And in reality, that's really the way it is too.
Now, when you enlisted and you chose this medical training, were you doing it with an expectation of serving on a ship, or with the Marine Corps, or both?
I think I probably understood that we were in the middle of a big conflict in Vietnam, and I was, certainly aware of the fact that Navy hospital corpsmen were serving with Marine Corps units. I didn't join with that intention. That was not my major reason for doing it. And people questioned my sanity too when I did that, because later on, as we got out of Corps School, got into the fleet, which is one of the first avenues that we did, everybody out there was talking about, do you realize that you're going to Vietnam? And I thought, well, yeah, that's a strong possibility, but I signed the forms. I'm here for the duration, whatever it is, whatever it takes, I'll do that. Not with any certain kind of bravado by any means, because I'm not basically a brave type, macho man. If anything, I'm quite the opposite. But that certainly was there. And they were telling us, my first ship was an aircraft carrier, and a lot of the guys who served on board had been overseas, and because we travel around and a lot in the Navy. We're telling stories about that. What your life expectancy in Vietnam is about 3 weeks, and that's what they told me early on in my career, right after I got my first duty station. So, and by that time I had picked up a stripe. I was now an HM3, and I knew that the ball was inevitably rolling in that direction, and I would be fortunate if I didn't wind up in that situation. But once you get out on a ship of the line, and you're at sea, and you're doing your job, and the aircraft are flying, and you're working on the flight deck, and you're doing all these it's really exciting stuff. It's certainly nothing like sitting in an office somewhere and punching the computer. But when you're in the actual fleet doing flight ops and all that kind of stuff off an aircraft carrier, it keeps you pretty busy. So, and we float from place to place. We don't stay at sea for 6 months at a time. We wind up in ports. The aircraft carrier was in the Mediterranean. The USS Shangri-La was in the Mediterranean, and so we hit all these ports. Well, that part of it is part of the learning, thing again. And interestingly enough, as I've thought back on all this process, it fits into what I thought of my global perspective of life, literally. you know, not just figuratively, but literally, got a chance to see a good part of the world. Just that first cruise. Some of the events that happened during that cruise, I got engaged to get married. My wife and I have been together, well, now for almost 44 years, but back then we were very young. High school sweethearts, blah blah. Everybody knows that story. Well, this is a true one that really worked out. And while I was at sea, I proposed via letter, and she answered and accepted by letter, and that's the way that got started. I'm a little bit off track here, but
Yeah, let's sort of back up a little bit to the track. So you go through, you have the boot camp, you have the corpsman school, you complete the school at Great Lakes. Where do they send you next?
I go to my ship,
Okay.
USS Shangri-La.
Okay, and how did they get you out to do ship?
I boarded a plane in Grand Rapids that took me to, I think it was somewhere in New Jersey, and then we got on a MAC-V flight from there to Rota, Spain.
Okay, what is a MAC-V flight?
I'm not sure what the acronym stands for now, but it's a military
military.
airlift,
Right.
military airlift command, something.
Okay.
Anyway, dropped us off at Rota, Spain. We picked up another smaller aircraft that took us to somewhere in Italy. And then from there to Turkey, and then when we landed in Turkey, the Shangri-La was anchored offshore there. They took us out in little boats, and we got aboard the carrier, and off we went.
All right. And describe the carrier itself a little bit. Was this a standard World War II type fleet carrier or
Yeah.
light carrier?
Shangri-La was a World War II vintage aircraft carrier that had fought with distinction in the Pacific during World War II. And at that time, I was in '66, so imagine how old she was. Quite an older carrier that had been retrofitted. Some of the original aircraft carriers that fought in World War II had a single flight deck, one straight deck that the planes were recovered and launched on. They had retrofitted some of the olders with an angled deck so that they could launch in two directions and recover at the same time. So there had been a lot of restoration made to the old bucket, and she was certainly seaworthy, but very old. Some of the old passageways just lined with tubes and piping and whatever. At that time, since Shangri-La was a smaller carrier than the modern nuclear carriers are, we only had a complement of about 2,000, I think, on the crew. In that part of my part of the crew was the hospital detachment, sick bay we called it. We had a full operating room on board. We had an operating room ward, about 25 or 30 beds, full lab, X-ray facilities, the whole 9 yards. Very small, very compact, but very functional and efficient. And so we spent a lot of time taking care of sailors who ran into airplanes and bumped their heads, and ran into other things while on liberty and bumped their heads. And spent a lot of time sewing up people. Learned a lot about basic examination techniques and a lot more of the technical things that you didn't get in corps school. And how to deal with medical records and how to make sure everybody gets their vaccinations up to date and so forth. That cruise lasted about 7 months, I think, by the time I got on board.
So do you recall where you went, or?
Places that we went? We went to such places as, well, actually, let's see, in the Shangri-La, I made 2 med cruises, so I have to remember which one is which. Shangri-La did spend a lot of time around Naples, Italy, because that's where the big naval station was in that part of the Mediterranean. So we spent a lot of time around there. But we were in Istanbul. We went to France, several ports in Italy. Naples, Toronto, Livorno, and again we went in other places too. But in France, Toulon, France was one of the places we went, and in Spain, Barcelona. And for that cruise, that was mainly it. Mostly hung around Italy a lot. The process of going into the different ports of different countries is a fascinating one too. It's when they say join the Navy, see the world, they're not kidding. If you get in the right situation, a lot of guys don't get to do that. I was fortunate to be able to do that. But I loved wandering the back streets of some of these places. Naval ports are naval ports the world over, and they have a certain negative connotation in most people's minds. But I found it fascinating to get out of the beaten path and get away from the wharf people, I call them, and the seedy side of life, and go into the back streets and wander. Even though I didn't speak much of the local lingo, if you travel enough in those places, you pick up a few words, how to order a beer and a bottle of wine and a pizza, all that kind of stuff. But the people themselves I found extremely fascinating. And of course we were in uniform at that time everywhere we went, the old Navy uniform with the Dixie cup and the bell bottoms and all that. So it was obviously we were American sailors. And a couple of us would wander way off the beaten path. We once went to an opera. It was in Naples, I think, which was a completely unique experience for both the locals and for us. I would have to say, with two sailors American sailors walk into an opera in Naples, it's got to be kind of a unique experience. But I found that was my way to get to know the people a little differently and feel it a little differently, and really spend some time with them. And for the most part, we had good times in the back streets by ourselves without all the hordes of sailors around, and wonderful food. And there's many stories I can tell you about those things.
Just on a general level, were most of the local populations fairly welcoming to you?
As a matter of fact, yes. I can only remember one case where there were demonstrators, and that was actually, interesting enough, in Rome. We took a side trip. The ship was anchored in Naples, and we took a side trip to Rome to see the obvious sights of Rome. And we stayed in a little hostel there, one of those little semi-hotel things that travelers use a lot, especially younger people. And there were probably, I don't know, 25 of us on a bus, and stayed there. And outside of that hotel, there were some demonstrators. We thought they were probably communist, because that's what we just would anticipate them to be. I don't know what their real thing was. And in fact, they were waving some signs and shouting things in Italian, which I didn't understand anyway. So to me, it was never a threatening thing, but it was obvious that they were demonstrating against our presence there for whatever reason. But it was more than compensated by the wonderful sights of Rome that we enjoyed and got to experience there too. So, and that's the only time, honestly, in my whole time in the military that I can remember seeing demonstrations. And I'm not altogether sure that they were demonstrating against us. I'm not sure why they were there.
Yeah, Italian politics were always kind of complicated, and there were a lot of things going on at the same time.
Yeah. At that time in the world, a lot of stuff going on. So, yeah, all told, that was a very positive experience. And going into the cities and whatever. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I went on another cruise secondary to that, but that was after the Shang returned back to port. We did a float down to Guantanamo Bay, or off the shore of Cuba for a while. So I got to actually touch the shores of Cuba. It's another one of these places I've been. We have a naval station there, and there's a hospital there, and we were, sharing stories with some of the local corpsmen and whatever there, and then shopping in exchange to buy cigarettes or whatever. It was a good thing to do, and go to the club and have a few beers, and then get back on the ship, and off we go. We came back, they put the ship in dry dock in Norfolk, and so right about that time, I got orders to go to the Fleet Marine Force at Camp Lejeune, which is where they send Navy corpsmen who are going to be going to Vietnam, and they need to be trained on how to become what we call grunt corpsmen. So I got my orders to Camp Lejeune, and then went to what they call FMF school, Fleet Marine Training Program. And we went through another process of about, I want to say 8-9 weeks of turning us from fleet sailors into grunt corpsmen. And that process is it's very intense. It's run by Marine Corps DIs, and most of the sailors, well, we were all corpsmen. We wouldn't have been there if we weren't corpsmen, but most of them had no experience with that kind of thing. And it was a matter of learning how to use guns, which is a little counterproductive to what our main role was to save lives, not to take them. But in order to defend yourself and your patients, you had to learn how to use weapons. So we did that. I will say that the weapons training for FMF corpsmen at that time was very, very brief. We got to familiarize fire an M14 and a 45. Of course, the TL weapon for a corpsman is a 45 because by the Geneva Convention we're non-combatants, and so therefore couldn't be allowed to have an aggressive weapon, which is totally antipathetic of what actually happened. Anyway, they took us out. They did the usual calisthenic drills and run around the field and do the hoorah shouts and all these little marching epithets that the Marines like to use all over the place. And then they told us how to go out and go on patrols, learn how to set up an ambush. They taught us how to defeat an ambush, because there was a strong possibility that we might actually get into one of those at some day, so we had to know what to do.
How much of an effort did they make to simulate the Vietnam experience?
Well, Camp Lejeune is a vast place with swamps, and it's almost in summertime. It's tropical there. We lived there for a while, and it's very hot, very humid. They actually had a Vietnam village that was set up there, which was manned by people in black shirts and conical hats, and there were pigs and chickens running around, dogs and everything else. That was not where we did we didn't do our practice ops in that place. That was a place that they set up to show us what it actually would look like, and it was very realistic. They even had a lot of booby traps and things set up, typical things that you might have to deal with later on. But mainly it was a process of taking us out of our blue suits and putting us into green suits, and starting to think like a Marine rather than as a sailor. And that's a very important little distinction that has to be made. I learned that later on, that you best function as a Navy man in the middle of a Marine unit if you think and act and look and talk like a Marine.
Can you explain what the sort of difference in mindset or
The difference
thing is?
in mindset between a Marine and a sailor are like night and day. And you can talk to any sailor or any Marine who haven't shared any time with each other, and you'll get these distinctions that are total blocks. Marines, they dress differently, they talk differently, they fight all the time, and they are a very macho-oriented, hoorah group of people who I extremely admire in this world, because they are trained to do things, and that's what they do. They are trained to kill. They are not trained to be nice, and pleasantries on board ship are very, very genteel. I mean, there's nothing. Well, there's some old chiefs in the Navy that'll jump all over you or whatever, but not like the Marine Corps. So we had to learn to look like them, talk like them, be like them, and do everything like they did. So we learned how to go on patrols. We learned how to dig foxholes. We learned how to set up, like I said, ambushes. We learned how to eat out of cans in the field. We learned how to build hooches, little shelter halves, set up defensive perimeters, all kinds of stuff that Marines spend months learning. We had to learn in about 6, 7, 8 weeks or something like that. And then from that point on, then you are transformed, and you then start to act and think like a Marine. And by the way, once you've made that transition, they start to treat you like a Marine. So basically, one of the greatest honors of my life in my military career was to be considered to be a Marine. They said, they'll tell you that today. You're one of us. Well, of course, I personally never felt that total, obviously there's always going to be that difference, but it was so close. It was such a collegial relationship that I came to love and I do today, love the Marine Corps dearly. Then what happened was, after FMF school, we were stationed at Camp Lejeune for a little while in a battalion aid station in the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines. Then we went on a float. We all boarded ship at somewhere in North Carolina, and off we sailed back to the Mediterranean, second cruise over there. And this time was a totally different experience, because now I was not a member of ship's company, I was a member of the Float Battalion Marine group. So we made different stops this time. The Marines go different places than some of the bigger capital ships do. So we wound up in places like Mallorca, Palma de Mallorca, the Rock. We stopped off there for a little while. Gibraltar. Wandered around the streets there, and again we're in uniform. But now it's not a Navy uniform; it's a Marine Corps uniform. They give us actual Marine Corps greens with our things on the sleeves, which is the only way you can tell the difference. So, and we go to Mallorca. Then we made some landings on Corsica and Sardinia, actual amphibious landings.
Now, what kind of ship were you on?
The ship that we crossed on this cruise was an APA, a troop ship from World War II. Basically, again, a vintage, old troop ship, which is basically nothing more than a regular cargo ship, where the hold is an enormous, big, open space, well, covered over, but in the below decks is an open, large room where bunks are set up 12 high or something like that. It was crazy. Anyway, you get a whole company of Marines in one hold, and imagine how big it has to be. And that's where we spent the cruise. We lived in those racks, and slept in those racks, and did all of our various and sundry things on those ships.
So what actual work are you doing?
The work that we were doing, well, except for the fact that I got extremely seasick on this APA, because those old troop ships bobbed and weaved on the seas, unlike the carrier had, which is obviously so much bigger. I got enormously ill with seasickness. But regardless of that, and that was on the crossing. Once we got into the Med, it was a little bit different. But we used to have to hold sick call for Marines. We'd go up and we had a little space where we would sit and listen to their chests and do all the physical exam stuff. They had a lot of colds and whizzes and things like that. And at sea, that's what we did. When we pull into a place to do the amphibious landings, we actually put the nets over the side of the ship and climbed down just like they did in World War II, and the little boats bobbing in the water, which was an experience in itself. And then go ashore and set up a hospital and run some drills and whatever, and then go back to the ship and do it all over again. Again, we hit some of the places in Italy on that second cruise, and then that pretty much wraps it up. We came back home, and then as I got to the States, then we had our orders for Vietnam.
Now that whole first chunk there of your naval career, were there aspects of it that kind of felt like having a peacetime job, or was the very fact that you were in the military and life was so different from civilian life, did that sort of dominate how you viewed yourself?
I don't think there's any way, having been in that situation, to view it in any other way than this is my job. I am a military man. I am a sailor in the United States Navy, and that's what my job is. Knowing full well what it was, too. At that point, I had no idea of how far this was going to go, or even if it was going to go anywhere. But it was my job at the time, and it was my life. Actually, I tell you what, I enjoyed it. I did.
Goalies!
So anyway,
are
you off now?
I just, yeah. All right. So you've had your mind or whatever is into the world of sort of being in the military and the Navy, but now at this point you have to make sort of that transition into really being a Marine on shore and in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Well, you get back. I guess we gotten you back to the States.
We're back to the States. The orders come in. There are 5 of us who are in the same battalion aid station, all corpsmen who are second class. We're second class by this time, E5, HM2. 5 of us from the same battalion aid station got orders to the same place in Vietnam. So after a month's leave, I went home with my wife, and we spent 30 days of whatever we were going to do, trying to live it to the best of our knowledge, because frankly, I really didn't think I was going to come back. So, spent some time with the family, mostly with my wife. And by the way, she was 5 months pregnant at the time, which made it even more difficult. But we just tried not to think about that. We stayed in a motel, went back to Rockford. Her parents lived there, my parents lived there, but we stayed in a motel by ourselves. We wanted to be together for that time. Anyway, so then we got the orders, and I took off, and the 5 of us that were at 2-2 in Lejeune went to this place in Vietnam, which was it was a combined action platoon training program.
Explain a little bit what that is. What's a combined action?
Civic action is what it is.
Okay.
The job of a combined action platoon is security and civic action. In other words, hearts and minds stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And believe me, the villages that we were sent to, they needed a lot of that. But anyway, it was a school where they taught us a few basic fundamental Vietnamese words that I've forgotten mostly, and a little bit about the customs and the traditions and all that kind of stuff of the Vietnamese, which to all of us was, as foreign as anything could get, literally. The language itself was just a big barrier. But anyway, the CAP units were designed to go into a certain area of Vietnam, into the outlying areas, and patrol through those areas, looking for the bad guys, really collecting intelligence that could be passed on to the major units, military units of the Army and Marine Corps, as sort of a roving patrol, if you will, which is exactly what we did. There was a squad of Marines, about 12, and I was the corpsman. It was led by a sergeant, and all the rest of the people in this little group of ours were Vietnamese. They call them popular forces. They were either too young to go into the regular ARVN, the South Vietnam Army, or too old. And so they sort of conscripted them into this, what they called popular forces. So you'd have at both ends, you'd have the older, 70-year-old guys and 15-year-old kids, and they're all toting rifles and stuff, they're all running around. And the only cohesive part of that band of about 25 or 30 people were the squad of Marines and myself, and all the rest of it was like so willy-nilly, because it really was, those guys pretty much, they were in there living in their own villages, and they basically were doing just like they would any other day of their lives, except they were now trailing around us to all these different little places in this area of operations that we had. It was just south away, actually. This is where that cap unit was. So I spent about 6 weeks in school and another month or so in the bush with this cap unit. And I had submitted a letter when I was going to school, because in the back of my mind I had this idea that I didn't want to particularly do civic action stuff. I wasn't enough humanitarian at that time to want to do that. I felt I'd really spent a lot more time with Marines, just for my own safety. It was pretty selfish of me, I guess. I don't know, but so one day out of the blue, I get a message from headquarters, meet me out at the highway, we're going to pick you up in a Jeep and you're out of here.
Okay. Now, by the time you actually got that letter, because you sort of put it in on your way out, and now you've been out there, had you adjusted to that life a little bit? Had you learned some things about it?
I had adjusted to that life. I probably could have finished my tour there We had a couple of run-ins with the bad guys. Well, we didn't actually, but there was an adjoining cap unit that was very close by, and they set an ambush one night and sprung it on some VC that were going through their area. And they were very close to us. In fact, they were so close that the rounds that they were firing were hitting the building that we were in. And it's one of these old school buildings with no windows. And rounds were flying through the windows, and I'm plastered up against the wall. And Smitty's on the radio, and we're just, what's going on? Because we thought we were under attack. We thought that little school building was under attack, and it wasn't. It was just right next to us was another cap unit that done stuff. But it was hairy, I would say, because we were a roving cap. We didn't stay in one place. A lot of them were permanent fixed places, and the more defense-minded they needed to be is when they were fixed. If they were roving, it meant we're not as defensive-minded. We were more offensively minded, and that we wandered through this area every day. In fact, every night we wandered somewhere else. We would set up a camp in an old Buddhist temple one night, and the next night we'd be over by the graveyard that's a mile and a half, 2 miles the other way. So sneaking around through Vietnam when we were very close to Hue, which became a very huge battle later on. Lots of bad guys in the area. Lots of NVA were in that area, and that was a different thing that us 12 guys, it was hairy. For me, it was scary. And sitting up in a cemetery at night, because that's where we would go. And these guys, the PFs, are out there on perimeter, and they're playing their radios, smoking and talking and laughing and all that kind of stuff. Well, I didn't feel real safe. That sort of just didn't jive with me very well. I could have probably done more good if I had stayed there, because I did manage to spend a few weeks working with the Vietnamese themselves in this little hut that they set up for me. I had my own little dispensary there. And there was a Vietnamese nurse who came in, and she would translate for me, and I would treat the Vietnamese when they came, and they would come to me, and I didn't have to go to them, they would come to me.
How did they view you, or what did they expect of you?
They called me Baxi, which is in there, there's doctor. That's their word for doctor. Of course, I was not a physician, and I had to keep reminding this nurse to tell them, I'm not a doctor, I can't do your appendix for you, but I can take care of your rashes and your scrapes and your wounds and all that kind of stuff, which is what we did. The thing I remember most about treating the civilians in that situation was that they had horrible teeth. They chewed betel nut. They have no dental care whatsoever, I don't think, and so they chew betel nut to the point where it just completely numbs their mouth. They can't feel anything. It's a local anesthetic, among other things. And they're all blackened teeth. They're all, pretty, I don't want to say emaciated, but they're obviously not well fed. They don't get any kind of medical care at all, out in the villages anyway. Some of the cities, it's much, Saigon and Da Nang, that's a different world, but out in the boonies, they don't have much access to any kind of health care. So the idea of the Civic Action Program is a good one. The ability to accomplish it, however, I thought was rather severely limited under the circumstances. Large groups could go and do civic programs, which they often did from our major bases. We'd take groups of people, doctors and nurses and everybody, and go out into the villas and do some good stuff. But one man alone with hundreds and hundreds of people in a very limited capacity to do anything other than basic first aid, actually, was not really accomplishing very much.
And did it make it more complicated because you were moving around all the time? Or were you in enough of a localized area that they would know you?
Over time, and I'm sure with the rest of the guys who had been there much longer than I, obviously they got to know these people, because even though we were a roving cap, it was done in a proscribed area. It wasn't just willy-nilly everywhere. And there were, like I said, more cap units in the vicinity too. They would overlap areas from one place to the other. So we had a proscribed area of operations, and we roved through that every day. We moved every day. So the people obviously got to know we were there. and that was actually for part of their security too. The unfortunate thing about that is that you never really knew who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, which is permanent even today. It's one of those things. The guys who you took care of during the day would come back and try to blow you away at night, and so there's always that element of suspicion too. So you know what, you sort of think, what am I doing here? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. That's basically.
Did you have much of an understanding of about what the war was supposed to be about at that point?
For them or us?
Well, for either, I guess.
I had a general, like I said, this general global view of what was going on in the world, and I certainly knew that the reason why, ostensibly why we were there, is the government decided they wanted to prevent the spread of communism in that part of the world, and for the average joker, the average guy walking around, that's about all that they perceived it all, and that's about as far as it went. Because most of the people that I spent time with over there were very young Marines. They were in their teens, right out of high school. I mean, no college, no life's experience at all. By the time I got over there, I had my 24th birthday there. If you take 24 and take away those years, those 4 or 5 years are amazingly different. And despite because I had been around a little bit and done some things in the fleet and with the Marines over, that gave me a little bit more worldview than they could have possibly had anyway, and obviously a little bit more maturity. And that made a difference. Just the age alone made a lot of difference. Now, I was not naive. I was not stupid. I knew what was going on, and I knew, even then, suspected that some of this government shenanigans were not the way they should have been, which was only been proven out in books and things I've read since. But again, I'll go back to this basic premise that in spite of all of that, in spite of the unrest, and we knew over there, by the way, all the stuff that was going on back in the States, believe me, because we had Armed Forces Radio, and people wrote letters. I mean, so even though we were 4, 5, 8,000 miles away, we still knew what was going on back home. And we knew that it was not positive, and we knew that we were not very popular for doing what we were doing.
Right. Let's locate this in terms of time. This is late 1968.
This is late. This is actually into early '69,
Okay.
because by the time I got there in October. I went to school, went up to Cap Unit, and I was only there about a month. And by this time, it was getting into the next year in '69, and then I got transferred out of there.
Right. But it's post-Tet offensive, and Tet.
Right, the '68 Tet.
Yeah. And Tet is sort of kind of a turning point in terms of just sheer amount of protest, and more things come out and get more attention in the media and so forth in there. So by the time you're over there, that is going full steam pretty much.
Yeah. And like I said, we were not immune to those ideas and those thoughts that were going on. And
What do you think morale was like in the Cap unit you were with?
The Cap unit was such a limited group of people, and they were pretty much living off the land. They were sort of on their own, completely independent. They were headed up by a sergeant who was a good guy. Smitty was a good guy. But they did their own thing, They didn't have to answer hardly to anybody except the command group. When every once in a while they'd get a directive to do this or do that, whatever. But they were a motley crew. I mean, didn't shave. Uniforms were all half cut off and sawed off. They were just basically being the military's view of a hippie. And so in their own way, they were living life like some of their compatriots back home. And I did not fit into that little piece of it either. I have to say that. And I may or may not have been able to survive that if I had stayed there. But I didn't fit into that little roving band idea, and I didn't like it. And really, it was forethought when I had written the letter. I was still in school, but it turned out to be exactly the way I wanted it to, even though it was probably more dangerous to do the thing that I wound up doing than if I had stayed there, and who knows what would have happened. I don't know. But obviously, it turned out to be okay, because I'm I'm still here. But having made that decision, again, for the second time in my Navy career, people thought I was out of my mind.
Mm-hmm.
They did, especially the guys that I knew. Some other corpsmen that I had come over there with were in this little cap unit too. And I passed back through the headquarters on my way out of there en route to my new assignment, and the guy looked at me and said, "You're out of your mind."
Now, when you would first join the cap unit organization, you had an option, or you might have been able to stay with the headquarters rather than go in the field, or
Yeah, well, that's another one of those little anecdotes. Like I said, I reported into this school with 5 guys that I had been together with at Camp Lejeune. All of us were second class, and all of us were going to be going into this CAP program. So when I got my orders after the school was completed, 2 of us went north to this place just south of Way, which was a big Army base. They had a huge enclave there with a fire base and a MASH hospital, the whole 9 yards. And right in the middle of that was this little Navy enclave that was just the corpsmen that were in this CAP program. That was all. And there were, a little bit of an administrative headquarters group there. So there were 2 of us. And when I arrived there with this other who was actually a buddy of mine, we got there, checked in, got our paperwork all started, and got the administrative stuff done and all that kind of stuff. And the first class, who was in charge of the office, the admin office, took us over to the club, over to the old club, or not the old club, but then we're listed, I keep forgetting. Took us to the enlistment club, and we sat there, and there were myself and my buddy, and this guy, and he says, "I have to flip a coin. There are 2 of you. There's one job opening in the bush right now. So one of you is going to go to the bush, and one of you is going to stay here and push papers. Now, does anybody, So I'm sitting there. Well, what am I going to say? This is a friend of mine. So either he or I are going to go out there. And I knew for a fact that I was probably a little bit better prepared to handle the bush situation than my buddy was. And there's a long story. I won't go into that because it's very personal. Mm-hmm. But so I said, okay, and if it's between he and me, that's me. I'm going. Not because I'm a hero. It's just I don't want this guy. I don't want him. He wouldn't do well, I don't think. So that's how I wound up in the bush. Now, interestingly enough, when it was all over and I was coming back through, the same guy was in the office, and guess where he was going? Mm-hmm. My slap.
Right, he got the job anyway.
So he wound up getting it anyway. And frankly, I don't know what happened after that with any of those guys. We never crossed paths again.
You're switching out of the cap units. You come back to the headquarters, and where do you go next?
I climb on an airplane, same one I did to get there in the first place, and flew back down to Da Nang. Landed in Da Nang. Some guy in the Jeep came by and picked me up, and off we went to the 26th Marine Regiment. And I remember walking in there, and also I had to tell you, when I got there, they handed me an M16 mm-hmm. that I had never even seen one. And when I walked in, my very first shop in Nam they handed me an M16. Here, Doc. Right. What am I supposed to do with it? I don't know what this thing is. Obviously, I knew what it was, but I didn't know how to, anything. Anyway, so here I am reporting, and I got my M16 and all that stuff, and go into the headquarters administrative hut, and behind the clerk that was sitting there was this big plastic sheet on the wall that was all broken off into regiments and companies and all these other places, and I looked up there and I saw my name, but I had just gotten there, hadn't even talked to anybody. I walked in and my name was already up on there. He says, you're going to be senior corpsman Lima 326. And I said, okay, whatever that
translates to Company L, 3rd Battalion.
Lima Company, 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, 1st Marine Division, yeah. And that was my fate. I mean, I knew that, mm-hmm. and that's what I volunteered for. Well, let's get on with it, So, and I spent maybe an hour in that little office, and off we went again. Another Jeep, and through the pass and around the corner, and there we were. I can remember When I got to that company area, I don't know if there were more. I think there were probably maybe the whole battalion might have been camped in there because it was right after Quezon, the major debacle that had happened at Quezon and the 26th Marines were right in the middle of that. That went on for months and months. Horrible stories that everybody probably is familiar with. The point of all of that is that they were pretty shot up. They were pretty beat up, and they were, not looking good. And as a matter of fact, the whole place, when I got there, looked not very good. Green tents are green tents. I mean, they're all drab anyway, but it's dusty and it's rocky and it's dirty and there's no place, there's no shrubbery, no trees or anything. It looked like an old rock quarry, which I think it probably was. It was a very large area. They had a whole battalion of Marines camped in there, all in these tents. The only thing that made it seem like a really military encampment was when you actually got close to the tents, there were little paths put into the dust with rocks all along the way. They had little walkways, and in between the tents they had a little walkway. And each company, when you came to the company, it had some little sign. It was all in little rocks in the ground, and the guys, were all inside, cleaning weapons or doing whatever. I walked in, and they said, "Well, you're Lima, senior corpsman." Yeah. Well, Lima company's right over there. Just head over there and find it. It's in the ground. Look at it. So I walk into this tent, and I said, "Well, I don't know a soul, not a single solitary person at all." And I said, "Well, this is your company CP. I'm the new senior corpsman here." "Oh, well, this is a minute. Doc Smith will be with you. He's over there. This is the guy who was outgoing. I was taking his place." He says, "Okay," and he comes over. He says, "Okay, I'm going to take you around to the company, all the platoons I'm going to introduce, because there were, six other corpsmen that I had to know because they were my subordinate corpsmen in this company." So he took me around, introduced me to all the rest of the guys who were there, and I think probably took about a half an hour, and this transition happened just like that. He handed me a little canvas pouch that he had carried with him at Quezon. That was a minor surgery kit. It had a scalpel and it had the forceps and the tweezers and all that kind of stuff in there. And he says, "You're going to need this." And then he said, "See ya." He was out of there. He didn't. I mean, the dust he blew out of there so fast, and I was left there. But again, not a single solitary person that I know, that's another story in itself, by the way, about Vietnam. But anyway, obviously, I made the transition, got in charge of that group, and we actually went out on a little camp out in the boonies for a couple of days and got to know the gunny. My point of view is unique in several ways, different than a lot of Marines even would be, because there's two ways that my point of view of the whole war and the whole experience actually is different. There's two major ways. One of them is that I was in actually a small command of my own. I had 7 corpsmen that fell under me, and I was like very close in part of the CP group. I was part of the COXO gunny group, and so was privy to all of the internal communications and all the directives that were going out to the other platoons in the field. And so my whole point of view was different than an average Marine would be, other than the fact that it was medical and not aggressive stuff. It was, and that's another. I guess there's 3 different points of view there. But those thoughts were not lost on me, and I knew, because I was older, that I could handle those kinds of issues that probably the average grunt probably wouldn't have been able to do. And I had been through some training. I had some experience. I had, like I said before, a little more worldview, which is why I could handle that different kind of a mindset more easily than some of the younger guys could.
And would the challenge be more knowing more of what was happening, or just having responsibility for some other men?
Well, see, the challenge was both. The challenge was knowing what was going on, because I was privy to, like I said, I was like that tight with the CO. I actually was his personal medical person in the field, so everywhere he went, I basically had to go. And so when the radio messages came in and when they went out, I was usually sitting there listening to it and communicating with them all at the same time. And then the other thing was that even though I felt, and I've told Marines this later on, those were my Marines. Every guy in that company, because of who I was there. I was supposed to take care of them and try to keep them well and heal them when they got wounded and all that kind of stuff. I took on the responsibility that each of those 200 guys were mine.
Now at this point, this tape is just about done, so I'm going to stop right there. About the people you're assigned to, can you describe a little bit the men in the command group that you started out with, the captain, the gunnery sergeant?
Well, I'll start with the CO. First Lieutenant Robert Allen was a Mustang officer who had come up through the ranks. I don't know what he had been prior to his commissioning, but at the time I met him, he was, I want to say, just first lieutenant. So that was significant enough. But he was a gruff, constantly had a cigar in his mouth. He was probably about 5'8", 5'9", not a terribly imposing figure by any means. He had a small wispy mustache, was almost completely bald. He was probably in, I want to say, maybe 40, or late 30s or 40. And he possessed the most extensive vocabulary of foul words I've ever heard of anyone. And believe me, in 23 years in the Navy, I've heard some foul words, but this guy spouted them as though they were, every other word was an expletive deleted. But having said that, he was one of those kinds of charismatic leaders whom you would follow anywhere, and we literally did. I mean, the stories about, follow this leader through the gates of hell and beyond, well, that's exactly what we did. And he made us feel that way. He made us feel that was our duty to do it. And he was one of these leaders who always led from the front. He did not lead from the rear. The thinking was, if you're leading a group of Marines from the rear, they can't hear what you're saying, because the guns are all going off. It's too loud. So you get out in front and you just show them what you want to do, and that's what he did. And literally, he had this, what came to be later a very extremely annoying habit of just rushing off in the middle of everything, and I couldn't keep track of where he was, and that bothered me a great deal. So yeah, that in a nutshell was Lieutenant Allen. He was very, very, I would call him a quintessential combat leader. Just from the ones that I knew. Obviously there were hundreds and thousands of other ones, but I can't imagine under the circumstances anybody being more of a powerful leader in those circumstances than he was.
Was it unusual to have someone that old to be commanding a company at
Well,
this
yeah,
point?
but the fact that he was a Mustang, had come up through the ranks, had probably been a senior enlisted, maybe in a warrant, I don't know, probably not a warrant. He would have been a senior enlisted in the gunnery sergeant, master sergeant range somewhere before he got commissioned. Like I said, I don't know what his prior service was, but and I want to say he was about 35, 40 years old. I know he was the oldest guy by far in the field, and I was not very far behind, actually, it being age-wise, because some of the platoon leaders were not as old as I was. Gunnery sergeant was guy. The one that we started out with, I wouldn't put it that way, was Gunnery Sergeant Kemp. Gunnery Sergeant Kemp was just as much of a icon, to use the only word I can think of, as a perfect example of what a Marine Corps non-com would be. And I mean this literally. Reportedly, he was on his third tour in Nam and had been there and done it all, including caisson and the whole 9 yards. So before I got there, he'd been through all that stuff. But he was a ripped, chiseled, perfect example. He would have made a good poster boy from Marine Corps. Blonde, short hair, blue eyes. He was probably about 6 foot, trim, very athletic. Always looked to be squared away. And again, he was one of those men who would, when he spoke, you listened, not just because we knew of his reputation, but the way that he maneuvered his troops and all that kind of stuff, and advised the CO and all that kind of stuff. Gunny, he taught me a lot of things. That comes into some of the operations we went on, but make a long story short, Gunny, on one of our operations, took me aside and he says, "Doc, I'll teach you how to stay alive in Vietnam." And I said, "Gunny, go right ahead, would you please? Because frankly, I'm scared out of my gourd here. Okay, so help me out." So he started to teach me some things. And one of the things he said was, you got to take that long dog chain tag off and cut it in half, and then put it on again and tighten it right up around your neck like a necklace. Because if it's dragging and swinging like that, if you're going to be crawling on your butt sometimes, you're going to get snagged on a bush and you're not going to choke you or whatever. And I said, well, that made sense, so I did that. He said, then you take your dog tags themselves and you put those little rubber things around them. Because if you let them swing on there, they clank and make noise. And if you don't want to be somewhere in the middle of the night, you don't want anybody to hear your dog tags clanking while they're dragging in the bushes. They're the same thing. Well, that made sense, so I did that too. And then he said something else. It was you take these little canvas straps we had. I used to call them a stretcher strap. They're like you'd find on a litter. They're little canvas things with a buckle on them and little straps. And you put that around your pant leg, just below the knee, and pull and put it there and buckle it and pull the blouse that's around your boot up so that it's stovepipe straight, not blousing out over the edges of your boots. He said, because when you're walking through the bushes, you want to have that leg to be straight, not sticking out and snagging things like snares for booby traps and such and whatever and all that. So do that. So I affected that thing for my uniform. And then he said, you never want to wear sunglasses while you're in the bush in Vietnam. And he said the reason is because you can't see the monofilament fishing line that they use for trips for booby traps. And he was right, they did a lot of that, so I never wore glasses. And then the last thing that I can remember him telling me was, and this became very prophetic, by the way, always know where you are and what's going on around you. They call it situational awareness. He said, keep your eyes and your ears open for everything that you can see and hear. Swivel your head around left to right, up and down, and especially pay very close attention to where you put your foot on the ground each step that you take. So yeah, I began to do that. I don't know if you want me to get ahead of my story here, but what happened was on one of our operations, I was walking alongside Gunny. He was about 20 yards to my left, uphill, and we were doing the snooping pooping thing, up, right, down, looking all around the place. I looked to my right, I looked to my left, and Gunny was up there. I looked to my right, and this huge explosion went off. And I turned back to the left, and where the Gunny had been was just this big cloud of dirt and crap that was still flying through the air, and he had been above us, on a level above us, so all of the stuff went above our heads. And he had obviously stepped on a very large booby trap something or other. We don't know what it was, a large mortar round or 105 or something like that. I don't know. But when I got to him, there was nothing more than a torso, and both legs had been blown off. The right arm was blown away. The left arm was hanging on by a few shreds of tissue. All of his clothes had been blown off. He was blackened torso, and that's the best way I can describe it. And he was lucid, which is even more interesting. Lucid and talking to us. And he said, "Doc, you got a cigarette?" And I said, "Gunny, you don't smoke, man." He said, "Doc, it don't mean nothing. Give me a damn cigarette, you know?" Mm-hmm. So I had to I lit up a Marlboro, had to hold it for him. He had no way of wanting a cigarette. So, and he died. And he was one of those people who, in the world of PTSD, I know I'm jumping around here a little bit.
Sure.
Excuse me if I do that, but I have to. There's a thing called survivor guilt, and a lot of us feel a lot of that, especially I do, because of all of the casualties that I had to deal with and take care of, and wonder why I wasn't one of them. But I've kind of tried to turn that around. When I talk to people now about things like PTSD, I talk about survivor legacy. The stories that we're fortunate to be here to tell cannot be told by those who were killed. And there are at least 58,000 stories that will never be told because they lost their lives, young lives. So it's incumbent upon the rest of us, I think, of survivors to tell those stories, and this is one of them. I just told you one of those stories. There's several more. The skipper got dinged too. My CO, by the way, Lieutenant, I only call him Skipper. Like I said, he had this annoying habit of rushing to the front of everything that went on. And this one operation we were on, we got into a big firefight, a major firefight with NVA regulars. It wasn't VC. We knew it because we'd been chasing them all day. We knew it was them. We knew roughly where they were too. Anyway, we got into this thing, and I'm sort of tailing Charlie. I'm bringing up the rear of the column. Somehow the company got spread out into a line. We never did that. We were always fanned out in normal positions for advancing. Anyway, in a big long line, and I'm bringing up the rear somehow. I don't know why I got all the way in the back, almost the rear of the column, but anyway, the stuff hit the fan up in front. The first part of the elements of the company got into a firefight up front. And it was around this base of a hill. There was this large hill that was probably, I'd say about 100-foot elevation, maybe not quite that much, with a slope of about 30 degrees or so. And the bad guys were on top of that hill. We didn't know, but they were actually entrenched on top of that hill, on the military crest of the hill, as opposed to the actual crest of the hill. So when the company started swinging around the base of this hill, they took fire from the top coming down the hill. So they immediately maneuvered and went into their, advanced positions and tactical situation, and then started to advance up the hill. Well, because of my location in the back, I was not involved in the initial volleys and all that kind of stuff that went off. But sure enough, when I looked up, the skipper was gone, and I had told him, "Will you please not do that, because we can't afford to lose you, and he was such a great combat guy, and he just gave us all the courage to do the things that we had to do in many ways. So of course he disappeared, and so there's a Marine standing there. I'm coming up and I'm running up now. I'm saying, "Where's Skipper?" And of course he said, "He's up there." And I said, "Oh, I knew that. Of course he is." So I take off my pack and I hand it to this Marine. I said, look, I'm going to go up the hill. Bring this up with you when you come and find me and just give me my junk, okay? Because I got to go where the skipper's at. So I grabbed my Unit 1 and my M16. I locked and loaded and started to go around the base of the hill. And they were still coming down. The fire was still coming down the hill. Well, I had to go up there. I mean, what are you going to do? You can't stay there, and there was no cover anyway. So just start running up the hill and you know, doing this John Wayne charge thing. And honest to God, if they really do exist, Hollywood does it one way, but the real guys do it another way. And it's, by the way, not as glamorous as it looks. It's frankly, it's pretty scary and hairy and all that kind of stuff. Pretty nasty. And then running up a hill with machine guns firing down at you is an experience too. I don't think they had any mortars up there. I don't remember any of that. But there was a lot of small arms fire. And I knew he was up there, I'm cursing under my breath. You don't. But I had to go. So, and I'm doing the Barry Sanders imitation. You know, this way, swinging that way, doing the zigzag up a hill because they told me a moving target was harder to hit than one run in a straight line. That's what they told us in FMF training. So I did that. Well, geez, by the time I got halfway up this hill, I'm completely out of breath because I've traversed half the hill going all different directions. So I jump in this big hole. There's a big hole there. It was probably from a big artillery round or a bomb or something. I don't know, but it was deep enough that we could get down into it and it was over your head. When I jump in the hole, and there's 3 Marines sitting there. And of course, the first thing out of my mouth was, "Where's the skipper?" Well, they just pointed up the hill. Again, I already knew that. So I said, "What are we all doing sitting in this hole if the skipper's up there? We can't be sitting here while he's up there because that's your CO. We got to get up there." Well, we had time for 1 cigarette, and I said, "Okay, all of us are going. We're going. Let's go." Over the top, we went over the hill, finished going all the way up the top of the hill. By the time we got there, the Marines had pretty much overrun the guys that were defending this hillside, but the skipper had jumped into this trench. There was a trench at the edge of the crest, the military crest of the hill. And sure enough, when he jumped in this trench, there was an NVA regular there with him, and he shot him. It went through his legs, didn't hit him in the torso, went through his upper thighs, both of them. The round went through both thighs and took off the soft tissue in between, which you can well imagine what that might. I don't have to get too graphic about that, but and so then, and he was saying to me, you know, I got there, a skipper. I told you, Doc. Says, the only thing he said was, "Am I ever going to have any children?" And I said, "Well, of course you are," knowing full well probably wouldn't. But one of the things you don't give up on the battlefield is hope. And even if you have to lie, which I did several times, many times probably, you never give up that hope. And who knows? I really don't know whether they ever reconstructed him or not, but I know he made it and is back in the States, is still alive, I think. But I don't know. I'd love to come in contact with that man one more time if I could ever find him, because he was an amazing person.
Now, let's now try to put a little bit more of a framework on this. You're with your battalion, you join your battalion, and then you do some small-scale maneuvering first, right after you joined them.
Yeah.
Did much happen on that, because in that rock quarry area, did much go on there?
The first little foray into the bush was just a road security thing, and it wasn't far from where the encampment was at that rocky place. And I think it was over Christmas, actually. I remember that because they brought hot food out there. But it was the first time I got shot at.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first time that you get shot at, and I'm sure that they weren't aiming that bullet just at me, but that's the way you feel, see. And when you've never been shot at before, it is an experience unlike any other. And that was my first listening to the sound of an AK-47, because that's the weapon that fired it. And the way I knew that is because that's the way they sound. And we were just sitting there, Gunny and I were sitting there having a conversation. We were talking about heat stroke versus heat exhaustion, which is that was the topic of the conversation as we're drinking some hot chocolate. And I don't know why it became that. That's just the way it was in the tropics. Anyway, so the first couple of rounds that are fired, I didn't know what it was. And I look at it goes like that. And then you hear like crack, crack. Oh God! Everybody's jumping and diving under the ground, and there was nobody around there. I don't know what those guys were. Probably a couple of BC that were just hanging around, maybe taking a stroll through the woods, and they decided we're just sitting there eating lunch. You know, we're having a big deal. And actually, that was the end of that. We had our warm meal. No major confrontation or anything. We just went and finished our turkey dinners and then went back to the camp.
Now, at that stage, was the unit anywhere near sort of full strength in terms of numbers?
They were. The reason why they were in that camp was to regroup and replace the people that had been lost at Quezon, and some of the people that were due to rotate out anyway. So that's what they were there. They were, 6 buys would come in daily and drop off 20 or 30 new Marines. A lot of them brand new in country, just like the rest of us to some extent were. And so it was a matter of regrouping and putting them back together again so they could become combat effective. Yeah.
Was there enough of a leavening of veterans there that they could integrate them effectively, or were they really just going to have to learn it going out there?
Well. Yeah, there were enough. This is like the gunny, and the skipper and the gunny and the radioman and those other guys in the CP group, and the other platoons had their platoon command. They had their senior NCOs and all that kind of stuff, and most of those guys, they had some veteran guidance there, but the vast majority of the people that went to the field in Lima 326, when I went with them, had never been in combat before. And that in itself is a story, I guess. But one day the order come, get them on up, and they brought in a bunch of CH-46 C-Knife choppers, the big double rotor jobs, and we loaded on board and thought, okay, we're off. Where are we going? I have no idea, because they didn't tell us anything. Just everybody get your gear and get on these choppers. So we got in. Well, we flew and we crossed the coast and went out to sea. Kept on going out to sea, and we wound up going to an LPH, which was going to be our operating base. We were a vertical assault group, 26 Lima Company, and the whole 26th Regiment actually was a search and destroy outfit who did vertical assault.
So an LPH is a helicopter carrier?
It's a landing platform helicopter is what it's called. It's like a miniature aircraft carrier, only it has helicopters and not jets or any other kind of airplanes on it. It's just helicopters. So we were all relieved we weren't going off in to fight a battle without knowing what we were doing. But we got into this thing, and aboard the ship they had huge spaces for crew, and everybody was, all Marines were put on there, and we cruised around for I don't know, probably a week, and then we got word there was an operation that was scheduled and planned for such and such a date, and then all the briefings start, and the Marines start cleaning all their gear and cleaning the rifles and oiling things down and getting all their web gear together and all that kind of stuff. And because I was the senior corpsman, I was included again, like I said, with all these briefings. So the skipper said, "Well, Doc, I want you to come in to this. We're doing this planning. You need to learn about the flora and fauna and all that kind of stuff where we're going, because you're going to be responsible for maintaining the health of my Marines." And so you need to know about all the bugs and all those critters that you might experience. So this is where these briefings went on. They told you roughly where you're going to be, what kind of terrain it was going to be, whether there's any water in those areas, what kind of terrain was it? Was it jungle, or was it flat, or was it hilly, or whatever? And they just try to give you all this information, and you look at maps and you get a rough idea where you're going to be operating, all that kind of stuff. So. That's how the first operation started, and again, the anticipation of your first experience. Well, obviously, I've already been shot at a couple of little minor things, but the first The night before, let me just say this, the night before you go out on your first major operation as a corpsman with a bunch of Marines, you have all kinds of crazy thoughts going through your brain. You just don't know, for heaven's sakes, what to expect. And I came to realize there is a critical point. There is a critical point, and it's an invisible line that you cross. And the difference is going from intellectual curiosity of what it's going to be like to be in combat until you cross that invisible line into a visceral reality of what it is, which is what all combat veterans have experienced. And it's unique to combat veterans, I believe. And it's a composite of anticipation, fear, all kinds of crazy thought. The worst thought that you can have, obviously we're all worried about self-preservation. Of course we are. I had a wife who was pregnant at home, and everybody has those stories. I mean, their families and their wives and everybody. That's one thing. But a more preeminent emotion that involved me anyway, and I think most combat people, was am I going to be able to do this? Especially me. I mean, I'm not trained to go out and shoot at people. I'm trained to try to save their lives. Am I going to be able to do that? Am I going to be able to run out there and grab some guy that is shooting at me and drag him back? Yeah, can I do that? I don't know if I can do that. And those are the kinds of things that bother you more than if you're going to be able to if you're going to survive yourself or be maimed or something like that. But when that, so this anticipatory thinking is what goes through your mind. And if you have a position of authority, and I had one of them, a modicum of authority with my guys, my corpsmen, but like I said before, all of those Marines, I took on this attitude of the skipper, which is one of those things that he taught me. These are my Marines. They're my Marines too.
Now, at this point, you've been with them long enough that the unit and the command group have confidence in you as far as they're concerned?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, we hadn't been together all that long. It actually was a couple of events that happened on the very first operation that solidified my role with the company. The skipper was kind of a sardonic wit anyway, and he called me the company surgeon. He said, you can call me skipper, but you're the company surgeon. Okay, so, and that's old naval terminology, of course. And so, and we made this sort of a tenuous relationship at first because we were total strangers. Mm-hmm. I had no idea who he was, what he was, and like vice versa. He didn't know me, he didn't know what I could do. Had never been tested before. Who knew what was going to happen? You find out quickly when you get into the actual event, and there is this, like I said, there is this time when you cross over this invisible line. That came a bit later, but the thing that solidified our relationship was something that happened on the very first operation. Within a couple of days after we landed, we had no resistance to the landing of the choppers at all, none. In fact, in that very first operation, which lasted well over a month, no contact at all. No enemy contact at all. Lots of casualties. Booby traps, mines, all that kind of stuff, but no enemy contact at all. Interesting. Anyway, story that hooked the skipper and I pretty close together was one day we got a call from one of the platoons, and I forget which one it was, first platoon, let's just say first platoon, called on the radio and said they had a sick Marine, and one of the corpsmen from first platoon was calling and wanted to talk to me, because so I got on the radio and I talked to him. I said, well, what's going on? He said, well, this kid's really sick. I mean, he's really sick. He's sweating. He can't hold anything down. He's puking all over the place, and da-da-da-da-da. And I said, well, I'm going to have to come down there and take a look at him. If you don't know what you're dealing with, I'll see if I can figure it out for you or help you out somehow. So I told the skipper, and the skipper says, okay, Doc, take a couple Marines and go down the trail. First platoon is just right down there, and let me know what's going on. Come back and let me know what's going on. So two Marines and I take off down the trail. We get over there, and here's this kid who is absolutely writhing in pain. He's high fever, 103, 104. I look at him, and the other guys are all standing around. I look at him and look at his stomach, and I touched his belly, just above the right thigh, and that's the point of tenderness. They call it McBurney's point. And I just put my fingers in relief, and the kid almost flew off the ground. I said, "That's appendicitis. That is a rebound tenderness from appendicitis, and he's got to get out of here right now, because he's about ready to blow that thing if he hasn't already, and that'll kill him." Mm-hmm. So, well, what happened to be that it was a cold, rainy day, and for normal flight ops, the choppers would not fly in that kind of weather. And there's good reason for that. You don't want to risk a chopper and its crew for something that's just not worth the price that they might have to pay. But there is one exception to that rule, and that is an emergency medevac. If I call an emergency medevac, which was my job, that was to prioritize medevacs and evacuate the wounded and such. Again, this is about my third day in the field. Okay. Totally green, as my uniform was. I had no idea, except my medical knowledge. I knew what I had. I had no question about that. I get back on the phone and I said, "Let me talk to Skipper." Let me talk to Skipper. Skipper comes on. I said, "Skipper, I got a Marine with acute appendicitis here, and he's got to be a medevac right now." And the Skipper says, "Well, they won't fly. It's raining and it's windy, and they won't fly." Unless it's an emergency. So he says, "It's your call." I'm thinking, oh God, I hope I'm right. I said, "As far as I'm concerned, this is a medical emergency, and this kid has got to get out of here right now, or he will die." Says, "Okay, Doc, you got the call, the bird's on its way." So they call the chopper and we medevac the kid, and sure enough, he got out to the ship. We got a report back that they operated on him just before his appendix ruptured, and so that started my relationship with my CO, which became even better from that point on. But that's one of those lines you cross, because they don't know you. See, one of the interesting things about Vietnam is another whole part of a story that you can tell is that it was such a unique situation in so many ways. Everybody was a stranger, especially the Navy guys. Now I know some units went over as units. I think the Army more than anybody else did that. But in my experience, while I was there, we went over as individuals. We flew over there like we were flying to Hawaii, just going on for and wind up in a war. And then the same thing was happening when it was over and you came back. You left as an individual too, that's part of the whole milieu of the aftermath of Vietnam, is that individual, non-recognizable, cohesive organization that you can rely on. You can't talk to you can't decompress with your buddies on the way home because you don't know who they are, and you just don't talk to anybody about that kind of stuff. I mean, anyway, that's another whole story. So the operation went on, from then, and like I said, that first operation, we had no enemy contact whatsoever. We did, however, run into a very large minefield that nobody knew was there. We were just maneuvering along the beach one day on this operation, trying to find the bad guys, and turned inland, went up, climbed a little hill, and then were confronted by this hill in front of us that rose up, and not very high, maybe 50, 60, maybe 25, 30, 40 yards, let's put it that way. Again, about a 30-degree incline. Very little vegetation. That might have been a clue, actually, now that I think about it. I don't think nobody thought about that, actually. The forward elements of the company started to go up this hill. The purpose was to go over this hill and then occupy some positions on the other side of it, which would have cut off the Batangan Peninsula from the sea, and that was the whole idea of this operation. Forward elements of the company got about halfway up, and there were, I would say, 6 explosions, simultaneous explosions, all at different levels up the side of this hill. And then the surreal vision that you have standing or watching something like this is that you see a little puff of black smoke or dirt or whatever, and then you hear the pop, boom. But you see the thing, and you see the guy go down, and you hear him screaming, then you hear the sound of this thing. It took that long to get across the little valley that was between us. And we had trundled into a very large minefield that apparently had been planted by Korean troops, ROK troops, Republic of Korea
Right.
troops, when they had occupied that hill. And it was not anybody's map anywhere. And so we obviously didn't know and blundered right into the middle of it. Well, as I'm standing there with the skipper, we had picked up this little Vietnamese guy as we were coming down the beach just before we turned back inland, and we found that we had this little guy who was the only one they could find, and we thought maybe we want to interrogate this guy, find out if he's VC or whatever, if he knows what's going on, because we hadn't seen anybody. There weren't even any chickens or anybody around, so something was up. And then we're standing there. The skipper is on my right side. This little Vietnamese guy is right in front of me, and I'm standing here and I'm looking right at this thing, and all of a sudden these things start to pop in front of us. And of course, like I said before, the skipper was going. He turned around. He turned to me and he said, "Doc, you stay here with this prisoner. Don't you go anywhere." And he took off running with the radium. And they went down across this little valley, and he was screaming, top of his lungs, "Stop, stop, don't go any further, don't anybody move, stay where you." Well, they started to move around because there were casualties, and we had a corpsman that was in there, was treating people, and he got blown up too. He was the only corpsman that was killed on my watch. That was in my company, and I barely knew the kid's name. But anyway, so here they are. They get down to the bottom of the hill, and they found a tank. I don't know where this tank came from because it hadn't been there this whole week and a half. All of a sudden, a tank materializes, and they had it going up this hill along on the right flank of the hill. The company was all over here. Skipper gets right behind that tank, and the idea was to follow that tank up the hillside, and then if there were any more mines, well, the tank would blow them up, wouldn't hurt the tank anything. And then he could get up there and they could work laterally rather than trying to go this way, and they had no idea. Of course, either way was very dangerous anyway, but anyway. Well, the radioman that was with Skipper, his name was John Fogarty. John Fogarty is one of the other of the trio of people that I talk about when I tell stories. There were hundreds of other. In my company there were about 200 men. Total TO strength of a Marine Corps line company is around 200 people. Of those 200 people, there are 3 that I can remember their names, and the rest of them, frankly, I don't, which bothers me because. But it was also a function of the fact that I didn't know them very well either, and because of who I was and where I was and what I was, it kept me from getting personally involved with all the troopers out in the boonies. So I didn't get to know very many of them. But anyway, John Fogarty, PFC, was the company radioman. So he was another one of those guys that I was so closely affiliated with everywhere we went. He was the skipper's main radio guy. John was from Arkansas, I believe, a farmer's son. He was a PFC, maybe 19 years old, ugly of countenance. He had big ears, flappy ears, crooked teeth, big beaky nose, and his helmet was 2 sizes too large because every time he turned his head, his helmet would kind of halfway spin around his head. But he was the very first Marine that I made connection with in the field on the very first operation. He said, "Doc, I need a hooch mate. You had to have 2 guys to make a hooch because you made a hooch out of poncho halves. So each half made 1. and you snap them together and put them on the stakes and all that kind of stuff. And then so you build a little 2-man hooch, and then we would sit around and drink hot chocolate and talk. And so John was the first guy who made contact with me other than the skipper, the first Marine that I got to know a little bit. So we sat there for a couple of days, and he would tell me little things, how to clean my M16. I told you I never knew how to do that. So John taught me the care and feeding of my M16. And he also told me how to make instant hot water for hot chocolate by using a little cube of C4 explosive. Touch a match to it, and it was instant hot water, just like that. You didn't have to wait for it to boil. It just instantly boiled. And he taught me how to put together the hooch and how to keep dry on the ground and all that kind of stuff. And just a young man, certainly not very advanced intellectually or anything like that, but he was, like I said, his countenance was not so pretty, but his heart was as big as the prick 25 he wore on his back. And he felt that he needed to take me under his wing because he knew how green I was and didn't have a clue how to survive out there and eat sea rats and all that stuff. Well, John was walking with the skipper behind that tank, and it must have gotten off to the side or whatever, because the tank set off a bouncing Betty mine, which is a charge that rises to above head level and explodes and sends out shrapnel at 360 degrees. And John got caught by that and was killed. So this is one of those stories of those guys. And I was not there at his side because I had been ordered not to go there, which is part of my survivor guilt, if you will, because my job was to be there. I mean, I'm a corpsman. I'm supposed to be there. I'd been ordered not to. And that's part of my survivor guilt. I'll live with that. I live with it today, actually. But, long story short, we had several casualties. One of my corpsmen was killed in that minefield. Another one was severely wounded, who is now a good buddy of mine still. Those kinds of things happen, and when they do, you just sort of have to reassess everything that's going on.
Now, this was the operation that had the code name Bold Mariner?
Yeah, Bold Mariner was the very first operation.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do you recall what happened to that Vietnamese guy? Did he just disappear? Or?
I'll tell you what, the events got so horrific, not just this minefield incident. We had many casualties. Exactly how many, I don't know. I know we had to get several helicopters in to medevac him. And frankly, I lost track of this dude, because right after that, we had another very large explosion that happened just about maybe 100 yards from where I was standing again. Again, they were trying to clear this minefield. After we had gotten the casualties out of there, we knew we couldn't keep on going up through that thing unless they did something to clear the mines. So they brought in an Amtrak. Again, where they came from, I don't know where this thing came from. There were actually some troops that came ashore, I think, amphibious landing, and that's where the Amtrak would have come from. Because I know we had people out at sea, ships at sea, trying to cut off the escape of these guys and all that. Anyway, they hauled up this Amtrak, and even today they have the same tactics. When you have a minefield, they still destroy them basically the same way they did 40 years ago. And that is, they bring in a large vehicle like an Amtrak. I'm sure they're more modernized today, but it's inside are line charges of C4. The line charge is a bunch of bricks of C4, probably 10-15 pounds a piece, all strung together in a line. And the idea in the very front of the line is a rocket motor that shoots it out of the thing and lays it down like a line. So then the idea is that line charge is then detonated, which has so much blast that it blows a lot of the minefield away too. That's the whole idea. And they're doing that with IEDs even today. Interestingly enough, they're still doing that. But anyway, and it's a very big explosion. It's a lot of C4. C4 is very powerful explosive. But anyway, there was this mishap with this particular event that somehow the line charge detonated before it had all gotten out of the Amtrak. And so there were crew in an Amtrak. An Amtrak is a very large vehicle, heavy steel, very, about the size of a tank without a turret, is what it is. And there were crew in and around that, the Amtrak. That thing, when it blew off, it lit off the whole charge, including what was still inside the Amtrak, which blew that thing into pieces. And imagine if you're standing and someone sets off a 500-pound bomb within 100 yards of you. What does that sound like? Well, it's probably more explosive than that in that line charge. I don't know. But the point of it was it basically blew this Amtrak and all of the people that were in it to bits. And this was just after we had just cleared the casualties from the other part of the minefield. And so what happened to this little Vietnamese guy, I have no idea. Because frankly, it was on this side and then it was on this side, and I'm thinking, oh my Lord, what have we gotten into here? And how many people have we lost just in this about an hour and a half or two of time in the middle of the day? And the offshoot, actually there's some interesting stories that came out of that event too. I have some documents that were forwarded to me from some people that were there, and some of them said that they went looking for casualties by helicopter and they couldn't. Let me just cut it off.
All right, so we're saying you've got some additional information
So
about
I have some additional information now that was forwarded to me via email attachment a couple of years ago about some people who happened to be there at that same event, and they were talking about the fact that there were choppers flying around looking for bodies, and they couldn't find anything. And I remember being on the ground. By the time I got over to that site, I did run over there, and there was nothing but a hole in the ground. It was just a huge crater, because where I was standing, a very large piece of that thing flew over my head, about 50 or 60 feet above my head. It sounded like a freight train, and it was about the size of a refrigerator, piece of it. So obviously everybody went running over there, and this was just a big hole in the ground, a crater. And finally, and this is a different company now. Lima company was on the left flank. I think it was Kilo that was in the middle, and Mike was on the far right flank. Anyway, I think it was Kilo. They didn't lose any of their guys, but this Amtrak thing was completely gone, and everybody in it. I don't know. I think there might have been some guys that were sitting on the tank, on the track too, at the same time, because you did that sometimes. You ride on tanks and stuff, And they figured there were. I don't want to exaggerate here. Let me say somewhere between 10 and 12. They think were involved in that, and they found some bits and pieces, enough to put into one poncho, half of 10 to 12 or maybe more. I don't know how many were. I really don't. And they were. That was such a huge explosion that they were literally vaporized, and there's no way you can identify any of that. And that's one of the other crazy things about war too, is that a lot of those kinds of things happen, and you say, well, missing in action. Well, yeah, missing because we can't possibly identify anybody who was on that track.
Now, once that happened, how much more was there to this operation?
Well, now, one of the crazy things was that the operation had just begun, as a matter of fact, and it was going to last for at least another month. And so one of the stories is that the battalion commander was riding above this whole thing, and what they often did is they flew above an operation and observed from the air and gave control, that he still wanted to go through this area. And and somehow someone convinced him that the wiser thing was just not to pursue this goofy place. We'd already lost a lot of Marines, and to pursue another avenue, which is what we did. We pulled back the way we had come back down to the beach and went further. It would have been south, and then back up and beyond this range of hills where all these mines were. And then we sat on this little plateau. Right, I could see the sea from where we were, and the idea, of course, was to cut off the throat of this, what they call the Batangan Peninsula, which is a fairly large thumb of ground that sticks out into the South China Sea, probably about a half a mile, maybe a mile or so. The thinking was there were a lot of VC in that area, and we were going to cut them off and push them into the sea. That was the whole idea. So we sat there. And we sat there, and then the monsoons came. And so we sat there some more, because when the monsoons come in Vietnam, the clay, the red dirt turns to clay. You cannot walk in it, you can't drive a tank through it. You might as well just sit there and get wet and cold and be miserable and eat sea rations for weeks. And it literally rains that long, and it doesn't stop raining for a week, 3, 4 days, 5 days. So you literally sit there in your little two-man hooch and just be miserable as you can possibly be, except for the fact that you're still alive, which is a good thing. And the Marines have a saying, pain is good. So, and then they have another saying that we use for many situations: it don't mean nothing. Keep on trucking, don't mean nothing. Well, we use that in all those situations where it either got too stressful to deal with, or it was just plain so monotonous that, So what did we do? We sat around and read paperback novels that we lugged along, and smoked a lot of cigarettes and drank a lot of hot chocolate, and that was about it. And eat sea rats. That's all you could do in those kind of conditions. The weather was just that horrible. Well, eventually the weather cleared. Some of the other companies maneuvered somewhere else, but we stayed where we were because we found this enormous tunnel complex right underneath our feet. And I don't know how they happened to find it. We're just kind of stumbling around with it, and some guy saw this big hole in it. Well, it wasn't a big hole, it was a little hole in the ground. I saw the hole. It's not a very big hole. Of course, they weren't. They were made that way on purpose. So we got this idea that, well, maybe there's something to this after all. And because we hadn't seen any people. It was, nothing. It was at least about 3 weeks or so. I hadn't seen a single soul. So we had these little guys called tunnel rats, and it was just a couple of Marines that just happened to be of short stature, who would take a flashlight and a 45 and go down that hole. And I'm standing there watching it. He ain't going down that hole for no reason. I was too big anyway. I couldn't have fit in there, but these guys went down there, and lo and behold, we wondered where all the people were. By the time they were all through, they had several tunnel rats down in there. We brought out about 100 people, men and women, and dogs and chickens and everything else. They were living underground in all this labyrinthine system of tunnels, and they were cooking down. They had running water, just everything, an underground hotel. And that's where all the people had gone. They went underground. Now, how many of those people were VC and how many of them, I don't know. But it makes perfect sense if I'm in a place and I know that there's a bunch of tunnels that have been there probably for a long time, because those tunnels are all over Vietnam. They've been there for decades.
Yeah, they built them when the French were there.
Yeah. So, and there was a village just to the east where we were. And of course there had been naval bombardment, shore bombardment from, of all things, New Jersey was offshore, firing 16-inch projectiles into the area, and literally had obliterated everything to our east to west. So that's where the people went. They went down in those tunnels, and we got them all out of there. And that was just, and then what happened was they brought in some ARVN interrogators, and we're starting to interrogate these guys and women, trying to find out if they were VC or sympathizers or what they might be.
Were they of all ages, and were there children?
They were all of adult age, let me say, and I don't remember that there were any children. We lined them all up in two lines, women on one line and men on the other. And then, of course, the Vietnamese have their own ways of interrogation, different interrogations that we're not allowed to do by Geneva Convention. So I won't go any further into that little detail, but what they got of them, I don't know. We called in choppers, took them all out of there, and then we proceeded to plant charges in these tunnels. I mean, for days they packed satchel charges down in these tunnels. And then, the last guy out of the hole lit the fuse. And I can remember standing there when this thing went off, and it was like an earthquake, just this huge rumble more than anything. It wasn't like a single big boom or anything. It was like a boom, and then the whole world was shaking like an earthquake. And then we knew that if nobody was going to go down those tunnels again. If they did, they'd have to dig it all out. And basically, that was it for Bold Mariner. And we did have a couple more events that happened. Again, we had a lot of casualties, but they were from booby traps. I didn't lose any more corpsmen after that, but I did medevac a lot of Marines from booby traps. I would say, almost want to say, the majority of my casualties were from booby traps and IEDs. They call them IEDs now. We didn't have the politically correct term back then, but and frankly, that is more applicable to me in that situation. Not to mean that we were boobies or anything, but they were trapped. They were definitely put there to trap somebody, and they were very effective.
Okay. Now, once the operation was officially over, what happened to you? What did they do with you?
What happened was, when the operation was over, somebody decided that we weren't making any progress, so they just called it off. And most of our operations were at least a month long, and it was always in the bush. We didn't have what they have today, like forward operating bases, FOBs they call them. We never had a place where we could just fall back to and get a fresh meal, take a shower, and that kind of stuff. We were in the field for 30 days. At least 30 days. The longest operation that we had in the field was I hadn't had a shower in 52 days. That's what I remember that by. So you can imagine what that must have looked like. Anyway, somebody decided to pull the plug, and out came the 46s, and they picked us up, and off we went back to the ship. It's lighter, by the way. Then they started planning for the next operation. So then the next operation was Russell Beach. And give us a week to replenish, get all the gear cleaned up and all the rust taken off the rifles, and off we went and did another operation. The second operation they were all in, well, with the exception of the very last operation that I was on, they were all in the same general AO. And that was between Da Nang and Chu Lai. The area was called Arizona Territory or Dodge City or whatever. They all had Western kind of names because there was a lot of gunfights went on there. That's what they call them. And then, so we were always in that same general area, but it was a large area. But the thing about search and destroy is that we went out on company-sized patrols. These were not little sneaky, snoopy, poopy things where you're looking for somebody and you're trying to be stealthy. I mean, 200 Marines in the bush cannot be very stealthy, believe me, at their best. And it was proven that those kinds of small patrols were getting us in a lot of trouble anyway, because they were running into things they couldn't handle. They didn't have enough firepower. Because by that time in '69, they were going into another Tet holiday, and they were starting to do all these attacks again. And in that area, the whole idea for us being there was sort of a blocking force to keep the bad guys, NVA namely, out of Da Nang. So we were operating south of Da Nang, and that was, I think, our main reason for being in that area. Well, the process of doing that is you take a whole, and it wouldn't be just Lima Company, it'd be the other two companies too. So we'd have three full company, full battalion of Marines out in the boonies just doing this search and destroy, and often together in roughly the same area. But I can never remember, other than the incident with the minefield, I can never remember actually coming in contact with any of the other companies at the same time. So the feeling was that we were the only one that was there, although there probably were other ones when they were in different places. But anyway, so we do the search and destroy stuff, and we would literally cross, we'd cover 2-3 clicks a day, and then we'd set up a camp, and then we'd do another 3 or 4 in a different direction, and then we'd set up a camp, and then we'd sit around for a day or two, and then we'd go back over the same place we had just come through the 2 days before. So it was this like a big, it was crisscrossing thing, looking for bad guys, looking for weapons caches, looking for food caches, anything out of the ordinary. And then the destroy part of it was when we found something, we just blew it up. You know, so, and if we couldn't find anything living, then we'd blow up something that was, you know, not living, a cave or a hooch or something. They just, you know, and that's what we do for days at a time.
Now, was part of the point of a lot of the crisscrossing to kind of play some kind of game of whack-a-mole where you pop up in the right place?
Yeah.
They weren't expecting you to come this way on this day?
Yeah, I honestly think that was part of the grand plan. The tactics, of course, have changed now. The tactics Marine Corps employs now are vastly different than what we did in Vietnam. And I'm hoping that they've done that too because they learned a lesson about all the goofy stuff we did over there. And you know, and my company was just one organization. The Army had a huge organization doing the same thing. The Army often got into bigger battles than we did because they were in more intensely occupied areas than we were in around that area. But anyway, so yeah, the idea was to wander and crisscross the same area we had been before. The second operation was more consequential in that we came across some bad guys. That second operation was the one where the gunny was taken from me, from us.
At this point, tape number 2 is about done. So we're
Am
going
I
to
going
stop
on
right
too
here.
long here?
No, sir.